What is the benefit for registering an ingredient for a brand with the FDA?
I think that the FDA is, we're going to have to cut that part out too.
I'm going to be editing this one. Hello, welcome back to another episode of Demystifying Cosmetics. Today's guest is Nyree Bekarian-Mack, who is a cosmetic regulatory expert, regulatory strategist, and clean beauty advocate with over a decade of experience in skincare and OTC regulatory affairs, complemented by more than 15 years in environmental health consulting, focused on chemical regulation exposure and risk assessment. Nyree's career includes working with high-profile brands, including Goop, Credo Beauty, and Dr. Whitney Bowe. Currently, Nyree serves as the Director of Global Regulatory Affairs at Oddity, where she leads the company's regulatory and compliance strategy. Welcome, Nyree.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Side note, Nyree and I have worked together for a number of years and are coming to you via the same town, mere miles away, which I think is very funny that I couldn't figure out how to record the two of us in the same studio. So here we are. As I mentioned before, this was something I think that a lot of people in the industry have either heard a little about, but there's a lot of confusion around it. And so as a background, we're collectively referring to as MoCRA is the Modernization of Cosmetic Regulation Act of 2022, which was passed by Congress in December of 2022. This is one of the most significant expansions of the FDA's authority to regulate cosmetics since the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was passed in 1938. So MoCRA grants the FDA new authorities and imposes a series of new requirements on the cosmetic industry with the aim to help to increase transparency and safety and to provide the FDA more authority to regulate cosmetics. Since, Nyree, when I spoke to you, you said you can answer these in your sleep because I'm sure you've had a lot of people coming to you with questions. But, other than that kind of blip in terms of like what MoCRA is, can you give us a quick overview on how the Modernization of Cosmetic Act, why was this important to pass?
Why was it important to pass? I mean, to your point, the United States hasn't seen any significant regulatory activity around cosmetics since 1932. There have been sort of incremental advancements in regulation, I guess, if you want to call it that, along the way. But there hasn't been anything major, whereas like most other major markets, Canada, the EU, even Australia, have had significant regulatory infrastructures put in around cosmetics. It was just, it's been time. I mean, there's been a lot of pressure from industry onto the FDA to say, we've got to sort of come up to level pace with other markets. And, it's taken FDA a lot of work and a lot of time to get to this point.
So would you say that brands and consumers have been lobbying for some changes in the industry, or do you think this was mostly led by personal care, professional industry veterans and people specifically on the brand side? Are the consumers a little less aware of some of the regulatory differences between, let's say the US, the EU?
Yeah, I mean, I think the average consumer is not really aware, but there are consumer advocacy groups. I mean, there are brand groups or industry groups that are led by pretty prominent brands to push, to put regulatory pressure on the U.S. government to help improve, chemicals regulations for cosmetics. Beauty Counter being one of them, Credo. I mean, the clean beauty movement has been very active in this space. And there are also sort of what I would call, grassroots and NGO groups that have come together to push local regulation, state level regulation. You see a lot of that coming out of like Washington and California. in New York. And I think those folks have been really integral in helping MoCRA get traction as well. I think with global economy being what it is, having more consistent regulations across markets is way easier for global brands to be able to do business. And I think they've been asking and pushing for this for quite some time.
Yeah. And so we will go into a lot more depth, but in general, what are the specific gaps in previous regulations that MoCRA aims to address?
Well, sort of a quick overview of what MoCRA does is it mandates that all manufacturing facilities that are making cosmetics are registered with the FDA. It's putting in good manufacturing practice requirements for these facilities. It is requiring that all products manufactured by a facility are registered with the FDA. And on the flip side, it's requiring that all brands selling in the United States are registering each of those products with the FDA. And we could talk about that a little bit because it's not quite the same as what people might think when they look at the EU and pre-market registration there. This is simply just listing with the FDA. There's a requirement for, not that there wasn't a requirement before, but there's more of a requirement for substantiation of product safety. There is product labeling requirements that are being updated under MoCRA. Record keeping requirements for adverse events, mandatory reporting to the FDA for serious adverse events, and then recall authority, which the FDA didn't actually have before, is also, and access to records for certain events. And the recall authority is really focused on like serious adverse events.
So for somebody listening in right now that maybe is not part of a brand or hasn't worked in personal care and cosmetics, it's not clear what potentially registering a product would do for them. What's the benefit? What is the benefit for registering an ingredient for a brand with the FDA?
I think that the major reason that FDA would tell you if you ask them would be because they can then potentially track adverse events more easily and they can implement recalls more easily. I really think that's it. I'd like to be able to say that there's going to be more of a push downstream for something like pre-market authorization. And this is like a baby step in that direction. But it's hard for me to really see that happening in the US.
Yeah.
That pre-market authorization for people who are in the know, that happens in the EU. And for people that don't, just really briefly, there's a full safety assessment that is required to be performed by a third party, by a certified third party entity in the EU before a product can hit the market there. So I really think it's simply, this idea of if there is a serious adverse event and there is this sort of like recall authority by the FDA, how do they implement that? They would, without knowing, where the product is or who's manufacturing it. And that's really just what it comes down to.
And just diving into that a little bit deeper and getting a little bit off track, in terms of that third party validation, do you think that the FDA potentially sees that as maybe stifling innovation, or is there such a large volume of new launches or new product introductions in the US comparable to other markets that it becomes a bit untenable right now and maybe in the foreseeable future to require that third party verification?
In order to do something like what is being done in the EU and the UK with respect to pre-market authorizations and the requirement for safety assessment and a full, product information file review, it would require third-party help. And I don't see the FDA relinquishing control quite to the point where they're willing to use third party help.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know. I think maybe the argument there too is it quickly becomes a barrier to entry for many brands. And so, when you look at, to your point, innovation and the proliferation of indie brands in the US, I think it does become really difficult for them, to be able to do business on the one side. On the other side, the idea that all these products are hitting the market and they haven't gone through any sort of like safety or efficacy testing, I think is a problem.
Yeah.
So, I think that's the other side of the coin there, right?
So in terms of timing with MoCRA, I know that obviously it was something that was passed in 2022, and there's been some delays in rolling out some of the areas that you touched upon in terms of changes for requirements for manufacturers, for adverse event reporting. Are there key dates that are now well established that brands and manufacturers should be aware of?
It's funny. I was kind of going through some of the timelines before our chat, and I think that FDA is blown right by all of them. So.
Yeah, because I feel like it's been something that the conversation has always been, well, we're going to have to start doing this, we're going to have to start doing this, but I haven't seen any, I think, line drawn in the sand in terms of this is the drop dead date that we need to start to transition or need to be completely switched over to a lot of these policy changes.
Yeah, like the registration and listing, product listing, that kind of went into effect. There was several delays there that finally went into effect in July of this year. There's a mandate for listing fragrances that was supposed to happen by the end of this year. That's not going to happen.
And that's fragrance allergens, correct?
Yeah, the fragrance allergens. Yeah. That I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I haven't even seen a list come out. I very much think that the list is going to be the list, the EU's list. Unfortunately for the FDA, that list is going up to like 88, fragrance allergens. Then that's going into effect 2026. So, I just haven't seen anything come through. And I think that, it's just there's going to be a lot of delays around it.
So I guess in terms of, you have done a lot of consulting. If a brand were to come to you and say, I want to be in compliance to either emerging or, current regulations, what are the areas that you would now tell them that they need to be doing?
I think the first thing that a brand needs to do is make sure that they're working with a FDA licensed facility, right? So that means that they're listed with the FDA. FDA knows who they are, and they are in compliance with FDA regulations for cosmetic manufacturing. That means that they're compliant and with GMP practices. That's the most important thing. Just to get off the ground. The next thing is making sure that they're creating a product that's actually safe. And that includes implementing, safety testing on their formulated products, but making sure that their formulas are actually safe and compliant with, with the US market. And, that can be a little bit tricky, right? Because a lot of times, smaller brands don't have very much visibility into what's in their product or how much of an ingredient is in their product. So, understanding what that safety arm is and really talking with the contract manufacturers about how to manage that is really important. And then, claims. I think substantiating claims, any claims that you make is super important, because even just beyond the requirements under MoCRA, and under sort of FDA and FTC regulations, we live in a litigious society, and so much of what happens to companies is based on, litigation. So, um, it's just super important that they have that piece really dialed in.
I think some major differences between the US and the EU has been in regards to that safety piece, where there has been some broad and yet vague language by the FDA in terms of what safe means, safe,
Yeah.
unadulterated. Has MoCRA touched upon being more prescriptive for the safety
Unfortunately,
testing?
yeah, no, unfortunately it hasn't. They haven't really defined what safe is. They just say that, your product has to be safe. And I think that unfortunately a lot of brands say, oh, well, we've done repeat insult patch testing and so it's safe. Or we've done ocular testing and so it's safe. But the piece that is missing, that is in place in the EU and the UK is that the safety assessment is performed by a certified toxicologist, and the entire formula has to fall into a margin of safety that is deemed safe for human use, and so everything is
for the route of exposure,
with the right of exposure. Yeah. I mean, so everything is sort of like on the table there. I mean, there's an evaluation of each ingredient, the concentration of the ingredient, the formula as a whole. And then, a toxicologist signs off on the formula and says, yes, this is safe for market in the EU. And that all happens before the thing hits the market. So, that's either performed by toxicologists that's employed by the responsible person,
which is the third, which we've been also referring to as that like third party validation.
Yeah. I mean, or if you are an entity if I'm a company and my company's in the EU, I can be my own responsible person, but I still have to go and I have to have a safety evaluation done and I have to have that in hand. That's not something that's been mandated by MoCRA. And I think the jury's still out a little bit about whether or not it will ever happen.
Yeah. And, what have you seen from like how MoCRA has impacted cosmetic companies from a regulatory compliance standpoint? Are you seeing a lot more willingness to conduct, let's say, more substantiated claims testing, more rigorous safety testing, more engagement, let's say, with individuals like yourself who can provide a lot of regulatory and toxicology guidance?
Yeah, for sure. I've seen a lot more activity with brands who, especially younger brands that don't have the infrastructure in place to do a lot of this stuff in-house. I think that making brands do these things, I think they understand that, it is a requirement now. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding still around things like safety and efficacy substantiation. And I blame sort of the vagueness of how the law is written. And I think, and I hope that in the sort of years to come, that gets fleshed out a little bit more. I think it's a really, really important piece that just never came to light.
Yeah. And what have some of the challenges that you've seen for companies in becoming compliant?
I think the biggest thing is just that is understanding what safety means.
Yeah.
Figuring out who's responsible for doing safety substantiation. How does it even get done?
Yeah.
Are there what evaluations, what tests, what assays? And then, the efficacy part of it too is really, claim substantiation is really, sort of a missing piece that a lot of brands just haven't really figured out yet. I think they want to, but, it becomes really expensive. And I think that a lot of times brands, say, oh, well, those guys are saying it and those guys are saying it and those guys are saying it, so I can say it too. But what you don't ever know is, what sort of testing someone else has done before they go and they say it. and it's expensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
It all costs a lot of money. So I think that it's really hard if you're an unfunded indie brand to come into this space now and look around and say these are all these things that I have to spend money on before I can even launch a product.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It becomes a shock to some individuals and I feel sometimes almost as if like a dream crusher when somebody comes to me and says, I want to launch this product. And I was like, okay, have you considered this X, Y, and Z? And it's like, what?
Yeah, what? I'm working out of my garage. I don't know what you're talking
exactly.
about.
And touching upon that safety aspect, and also, the area of the MoCRA mandating more frequent inspections, let's say by FDA registered facilities, but also adverse event reporting. How can companies prepare to be more compliant? We are touching upon safety, but just kind of, tossing it around like safety. And, you did say, some brands see RIPT as, that's the repeat insult patch test. I was told by an individual who isn't from the industry that acronyms could sometimes be confusing. So hence why I'm enforcing this. What does that acronym stand for? But what are the recommendations that you would make to any brand, regardless of size, as a very standard and comprehensive way to substantiate safety of their product for topical application?
Brands need to start being more responsible with their products and the product development process, and they need to not take for granted or stop taking for granted a contract manufacturer having their best interest in mind. With respect to sort of really anything, but specifically, safety substantiation. It is incumbent on the brand to be responsible for substantiation of safety of their product and efficacy of their products, regardless of who actually makes the products. And so, they need to have these really careful conversations with the contract manufacturers before they get into contract with them, during the product development process, during the manufacturing process, to really understand, how safety is evaluated, what their quality measures are, because that's another part of it is product quality. And I think a lot of times people don't really consider quality and safety being, going hand in hand, and microbial contamination being a really good example of how poor quality management can develop into a safety problem, and having then some microbial contaminant in your product, and then you launch a product, and then you got problems. So I think brands just have to have they have to have really clear involvement with their contract manufacturers' entire process, especially if there's no quality person on board at the brand or regulatory person on board at the brand. A lot of times brands are defaulting, a PD person and a marketing person, and that's it. And so, they either need to, hire a consultant or, to keep really close tabs on the contract manufacturers so that, they really see the process through.
Yeah. I like what you said in terms of the, safety also involving quality. I think something that you've taught me over our years together was really, scrutinizing those safety data sheets, the C of A's, the compositional statements, the manufacturing flowcharts for each raw material. Has MoCRA touched upon anything to do with raw material suppliers in terms of the transparency that they can provide?
They have not. No.
Would you recommend?
It's interesting.
I feel as if this might be a gap. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is, but it's really interesting. And, I'm not quite sure if, I can't really say if the EU, I don't think the EU does really either, but yeah, the EU has that question.
Yeah. The EU has, what is that program called? REACH. They have REACH in terms of evaluating chemicals that are imported into their country for regardless of use, industrial, textile, consumer, but they have REACH, correct? That's kind of their governing body in terms of evaluation of ingredient safety. I think we've seen in terms of, some of the memos that have come out, even in terms of the role of the EPA in evaluating new ingredients, that maybe there's been a little bit of controversy in terms of what was approved because it benefit capitalism versus safety. Is there, do you think, any plans for the FDA and specifically MoCRA to start reaching beyond just brand responsibility, but more into legislation of raw material suppliers or raw material manufacturing and the transparency that they provide?
There is nothing like the systems that are in place in the EU. There's nothing like that here. And so I think that, in the EU, you've got REACH, but you also have, this sort of like, chemical safety regulatory, umbrella under the EU Cosmetics Act or regulation. And there's nothing like that here. I mean, I think the US still only regulates like a handful of chemicals, for cosmetic use. And then even then it's sort of like there's just not a cohesive system here at all.
Yeah.
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure. Things like air and light that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucaps line by going to tagra.com/cellucaps. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
How do you think as a whole, the industry has been receptive or not receptive to the changes that MoCRA has proposed?
Honestly, I think people were really freaked out at first, but then, I think that once they realized, this is my impression anyway. I think once brands realized that, the real sort of like tasks under MoCRA, I think it became less of a bear. Brands that were already following EU regulations, I think, had a really easy time transitioning under MoCRA.
Yeah. Do you think that, or have you observed at all it encouraging or slowing down innovation?
No, not at all, actually. I don't think that it's really hindered any innovation or development. There's just as many brands being launched now as there were 2 years ago, if not more.
So for the areas that MoCRA touches upon, we talked a little bit about safety, having some gaps in terms of, again, that being very prescriptive in terms of the list of assays that a brand should conduct. We touched upon adverse event reporting. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with adverse event reporting, but an adverse event is considered anything that's untoward. So you get a skin irritation, you suffer from more serious complications, to even death, right? That's a serious adverse event, is considered, death or other bodily harm. What are now the requirements from MoCRA in terms of adverse event reporting that were not in place before?
So, adverse events reporting, well, first we start with adverse events record keeping. And so now under MoCRA, brands are required to have a record keeping system for any incoming complaints about adverse events.
Are the complaints, can they be direct to the brand? Can they be through social media? Where are these complaints generally filed or logged?
So one of the main stipulations under MoCRA is that there has to be a responsible person printed on pack on your product packaging. Secondary product packaging, primary product packaging. It has to be a name and contact information. For US based brands, that could just be the brand name, and it could be the website, or as FDA likes to call it, electronic contact.
Oh, it sounds very outdated. Okay.
I mean, it could be a phone number. It could be a name and address. Like, it could be Jennifer Cookson at, wherever. But if it, and the FDA is pretty clear on this, they say, like, if it is website, it has to be the website, the landing page has to have a very clearly marked place for consumers to go to file a complaint.
Got it. Like a contact us.
Contact us, or something like that. And that whatever form, that if it's an email address or whatever, has to be manned by a person. And that person needs to be collecting if it's just normal customer complaints, like, oh, my package leaked or something like that, like that's coming through most likely too. But then there has to be a way to lodge adverse events reports. So if there was like eye stings or rashes or something like that, to more serious things like an allergic anaphylaxis, or somebody died because they put they were using your blush. I don't know, but that's now a requirement. And once the brand gets in a report of a serious adverse event, they've got 15 days to file a report with the FDA.
And are there standard templates that are provided now by the FDA? I know adverse event reporting was something I did very early in my career, but it was not a standardized system. It was really dictated company by company. Are there now standardized forms for? Yeah,
you can go to MedWatch and download the form, or actually just fill it out online. And it's very similar to the drug adverse events report form that's on there. There was, I think there had been at one point not a separate form, but FDA has now separated them. And so you can access a separate form for cosmetics.
So it's 15 days within report. Now, is this any adverse event, or is this a certain degree? Because they do have obviously different degrees of adverse event.
Yeah, just serious adverse events.
Okay. So the non-serious ones still need to be logged under MoCRA, but not necessarily reported in a timely fashion, correct?
That's right.
Okay. And then in terms of that, overall, let's say the brand gets 15 adverse event reports, none of them serious. Are you required then to file them with the FDA on an annual basis now?
For non-serious ones?
For non-serious.
Non-serious do not have to go to the FDA at all. No.
Okay. All right.
Which is nice, but it's a good way to understand your product, right? And to see if there are certain trends. Maybe you're using something, maybe you didn't do repeat insult patch testing.
I know, it's like it's so hard to not use an acronym.
Maybe you didn't do RIPT testing, and you are finding that your product causes rashes on 30% of your consumer base. That's not a good thing. So you can use this information to reformulate.
So in the case of a serious adverse event that you then report to the FDA, what is then the authority that the FDA has, or what is the action that they are able to take now in terms of the MoCRA legislation? Well,
FDA will evaluate the complaint. They'll look to see, how serious it is, obviously. They will also look to see if it's an isolated incident or if it starts becoming a pattern with consumers that are using your brand or your product. And if they see that it is some sort of breach in manufacturing, or there's a safety issue with your formula, then they can issue a mandatory recall.
And the mandatory recall, that's something that MoCRA now allows the FDA authority over, which just as comparison before, what authority, if any, did they have in terms, could they create cease and desist letters? What was the level of change that they are now permitted?
So under pre-MoCRA conditions, the FDA didn't have any ability to mandate a recall. They could ask you to very nicely. And if your
strongly suggest you to, yeah, okay, all right.
If your product was causing, like 20% of your users to, I don't know, go blind, they could very nicely ask you to conduct a recall or issue a recall. And if you didn't want to do that, then their only course of action, I believe, was to sue you.
Yeah. Okay. So there's an episode that launched where we talked with Avril Love, who you've worked with, and actually you recommended me to. And, part of what her position and what she sees is that the litigious nature of cosmetics really has been the driving force for brands to conduct safety efficacy testing.
Yeah.
Do you think that this, for MoCRA specifically, this is an attempt to maybe drive a little less of that responsibility away from consumers and more towards brands and a governing body?
Maybe, but I think the only way that they can really close that loop is to mandate safety testing, or I guess mandate pre-market authorization for all cosmetic products.
Cosmetic, yeah.
I mean, it was like, I don't know how else I really don't know how else that they would kind of take the
tip the scale,
the scale, away from like the lawsuit land. I mean, there are far fewer lawsuits on cosmetic products in the EU, and that is largely because there's pre-market authorization. The responsible people or person or safety assessor, they're mandated to go through, not just the safety, but all the substantiation, the labeling, everything. They have to approve everything, and then they're on the line as well for recourse, government recourse, I guess. So I don't know. I don't know how MoCRA will get that done.
Has legislation touched upon labeling at all? Changes in labeling to primary packaging or language that's used in marketing?
No, not under MoCRA. That is done still under the Fair Package and Labeling Act and the FTC requirements for product labeling.
I am curious to hear a little bit more on how MoCRA has legislated impurities such as PFAS or formaldehydes.
Well, it hasn't yet.
How it intends to?
How it intends to. So under it's just really interesting that to me that MoCRA, like there's only really two impurities that it deals with, which is asbestos. Well, yeah, asbestos free, I guess, asbestos, formaldehyde, and PFAS.
Yeah.
And it really hasn't done anything. Like there's supposed to be a proposed rule for use of formaldehyde in hair smoothing and straightening products.
Yeah.
So formaldehyde releasers. That was supposed to happen July of this year, I think, and that just didn't happen. Yeah. There's supposed to be an evaluation on testing of asbestos in talc.
Okay.
I believe that's happened. And then there's supposed to be an evaluation of the use of PFAS in cosmetics, and that hasn't happened.
Okay.
They're all
is the intention of the testing, have they set limits? Or is this more of just, encouraging companies to do that testing to see where their baseline is at?
I think there needs to be, they're trying to set a standard testing protocol for asbestos. I mean, I think asbestos has been there is no, I don't believe that there is a standardized test for asbestos in cosmetics.
Okay.
As opposed to like air samples.
Yeah.
Right.
So they don't necessarily know right now what a limit could look like. They first need to know how prevalent it is.
That's
Okay.
right.
And how to tell. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Okay.
MoCRA's not that scary. I mean, the thing that I tell brands, that I've been telling brands, brand owners that come to me all freaked out about MoCRA is, we just, because there's so many questions, there's so many holes.
Yeah.
Like it's a really awesome baseline, right?
Sure.
Start.
Yeah.
But there's so many holes, and everyone that was freaking out about it, I just sort of say, look, you're not in the EU, you're not planning on being in the EU anytime soon. We just follow their rules. If you play by the EU rules for product development, safety and efficacy substantiation, then you'll be just fine. And you don't have to ask a ton of it's still scary and it's still really daunting.
Sure.
But at least you don't have a bunch of holes.
Yeah. I feel that brands that maybe were more principled in their approach to substantiation, to safety, to transparency, to ownership of the entire product development process, it's probably a lot less scary than maybe brands that maybe were a little bit more hands off. In terms of companies that are, let's say in the former category of being principled, what proactive steps can they take to stay ahead of future changes? And where, I always default to you for, kind of what's the rumbling in the industry? What are some of the changes that may be on the horizon? But I don't think that's easily accessible to a lot of people. So, how can a brand stay abreast of future changes and anticipate being in compliance to also obtaining information on what may be changing or even influencing these changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that following a good industry group, is you don't have to be a member of industry group. Some of them are extremely expensive. I mean, some of them are a lot more accessible, but just following along, most of them have really good, monthly newsletters that deal with domestic and foreign regulatory updates.
Sure.
And then just get on a call every once in a while with these groups and just listen to see what's happening.
What's a good one to recommend that maybe is not too cost prohibitive or seen in the industry as being a leader in this area? Yeah,
I think independent beauty is probably a good start. I mean, it's pretty inexpensive. PCPC, is a industry heavy hitter, but yeah. So joining a group like Independent Beauty Association is a really good start. If you have the means, to hire a consultant, a regulatory or quality consultant, I think that's always a good move, especially if you're a really small team. And, FDA has workshops a couple of times a year on upcoming changes to their regulations. And I think, MoCRA being, at the top of the list there for a lot of people, I think that, they have fairly decent updates.
It's interesting because I think it was working with you once. We had a question and you were like, I'll just call the FDA. And so they're surprisingly very responsive with inquiries. As long as you kind of you find the department that you need to be. I've sent emails before and actually received a response in a fairly timely manner in terms of questions I had for new materials, whatever that may be. So the FDA does seem to be fairly responsive in terms of outreach, inbound outreach.
Yeah, you can call CEDAR, which is the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and they have an arm that's sort of like the small business arm. And even though, if you're a cosmetic company, you're not a drug researcher, you could still ask them questions. And sometimes you do get somebody that's really well informed and is willing to have a conversation with you.
Yeah. Awesome. Something I've been asking guests is a little bit more on what they are really interested in having conversations about. What's something that, you're seeing or something that, you've often found yourself thinking about being like, wish somebody would be talking about that?
No, I mean, I guess, I mean, I don't know if it's a very sexy topic, but I just wish more people, more brands, more people were talking about claim substantiation in cosmetic products. I mean, I think that, safety is definitely important, but like of the things that sort of like sell,
Yeah.
there's so much overstatement of what a product can do. I've seen ingredients go into a product at 0.00001%, and they're like, we've got this magic material, magic chemical in here, and it's going to do all these things for you. And I just think that, like, people are buying it. People buy stuff based on these claims. And, I don't know if it's the power of like the placebo effect or what, but, a lot of brands really flourish and like their products can't do a thing. I mean, like, there's definitely like really poorly conducted efficacy testing, but I mean, at least that's being done. I think by and large, most brands don't do efficacy testing. And then they're making claims. Yeah. And then they're making claims off of, an ingredient that they have in there that may or may not be at therapeutic levels, but they've never tested that. They're making formula-based claims. And this is a distinction. They're making formula-based claims or product level claims based on an ingredient that's in formula, but they've never actually tested the formula. So yeah, it's the Wild West as far as like, as far as that's concerned. And like, I mean, I can talk for hours about that. I've seen some things.
And I guess my last question for you would be, you've always been in a tough spot in terms of being a regulatory consultant to even being now in-house regulatory compliance, because, I think, you're telling people to do things that maybe cost more money, extends more timeline. How do you think we can influence brands to start investing in doing things that are, more principled for consumer safety and transparency? What have you found to be the greatest influencer in getting brands to buy into doing testing that really, MoCRA is not mandating, but broadly is suggesting needs to happen? What have been the biggest influencers for you in terms of getting that message?
The threat of being sued, and poor PR.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair.
Those are the only two things that actually work for a brand.
Yeah.
I think that I've in my career as a long career as a consultant, the only thing that I've ever really seen driving change is, I mean, for the most part, is the threat of a lawsuit and bad PR, negative publicity. Yeah. There's very few brands out there that are doing things because they think it's the best thing to do.
Well, that has been an all-encompassing and exciting conversation that probably will need a follow-up. But thank you, Nyree, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I'm excited.
It's the only one you're going to watch, but it's fine. It's fine.
Maybe. No, watch it religiously.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.